Terence Lester with us. I'm so stoked for this conversation, Terence. There's a lot of things that you do in the world. One of those things is you're the founder of Love Beyond Walls, which is a not-for-profit organization focused on poverty awareness and community mobilization. And so you do a lot of other things. And you also are the recent author of All God's Children: How Confronting Buried History Can Build Racial Solidarity. I'm so excited for this conversation. But before we get into talking about the book, and while I defog my glasses, I just took a shower, so my glasses are all foggy right now. So if you're watching the video, you're probably like, what's going on with Mason's eyes? While I defog my glasses, I want to hear, Terence, from you. Who is Terence Lester to Terence Lester?
Yeah, I guess personally, I would say that I am, you know, uh, just a person with a huge heart. And when I say that, I don't say it in the cliche way. I just mean that I like to be real and transparent and as vulnerable as I possibly can. That's how I like to show up in the world. And that's how I show up in my family. And so I am a husband as well. I am a father, and my family is extremely important to me as we, navigate life together. And I just love people. I love people from all walks of life. Uh, I try to orient or posture myself in a way where if I encounter anyone, I want to make sure that person leaves my presence
Mm,
feeling seen and feeling heard. And that doesn't matter whatever social location they may emerge from. And so
hmm
I really try to orient myself and my life in that posture. Yeah.
I love that. I love that. And also, I totally failed to mention, and I apologize for this. You are now Dr. Terence Lester. Congratulations. I know it's pretty recent development in your life, but congratulations on getting your doctorate. I know that it is not an easy task to undergo all of that education and study and all the time and energy and effort that you would pour into something like a PhD. So congratulations on that.
Yeah, thank you. That means a lot coming from you, man. I've followed your work for a while, and I think the work of scholarship itself is to lift and center the voices that have been silenced. And so, I've seen personally in my scholarly journey that I'm not obtaining scholarship for the sake of myself or some type of elitist institution, but that it builds more capacity in me to show up in the world to stand in solidarity with whoever I come in contact with. Right.
Totally.
Yeah.
Well, I'm sure it also is a little nice to call yourself Doctor Terence
Yeah.
Lester now.
Just just a
It's
tad.
a nice little thing. Feels
Yeah,
nice.
just a tad, just a tad. Yeah,
Love that. Well, let's
yeah,
chat about the book, All God's Children, pretty recently released, and we're just super, super stoked to chat a little bit about it. Uh, Before we dive into like some of the content of the book, I want to hear a little bit more about kind of like the writing process for you and what that was like. Certainly this book has a lot of history in it. There's a lot of theology, even. There's a lot of even a little bit of your personal narrative and everything. Was there anything when you were doing like research for this book, right? And I know this isn't like a scholarship kind of book or whatever. This is not an academic text at all, but I
yeah.
know you certainly did some research while you were writing this book. Was there anything in that research that came up where you're like, wow, I had no idea about that before? Maybe it was something about history. Maybe it was when you were researching some like theology or something or some biblical stuff or whatever it might have been. But yeah, was there anything that came up in the research where you're like, wow, I had no idea about that?
Yeah, I came across, interesting research by, a professor and scholar. His name is, Dr. LeGarrette King,
Okay.
and he grounded his, like, research in this idea when lions write history, and so he looked at, the Reconstruction era all the way to the 1940s and 50s and did like a excavation of the ways in which Black people are depicted in history,
Mm,
um, the intentional exclusionary practices that exclude Black history from maybe a Eurocentric historical perspective. And man, just like the ways in which he looked at the intentional removal of history was just like profound to
mm,
me. And one of the reasons why is because I really connected with that. With my K through 12 experience, man, if I'm honest, I did not encounter Black history
Mm.
in a way that spoke to my existential realities,
Mhm.
myself as a Black man, person. And, I had to rely heavily on the oral traditions of talking to my grandparents and such to kind of like lightly mine out nuggets of history that impacted them and their parents and their grandparents, but also how that has been passed to me generationally. And I was just wrestling with the idea of why, why is history removed? Why was it removed? And it just, over and over again, we are even seeing that right now.
Right. Totally.
The intentional impact of like why that is done to keep people from really encountering the truths of Black history.
Right. And now, I mean, we're even seeing like a kind of restructuring of history of like there was the recent thing in Florida about like teaching history, like specifically slavery history, as like, oh, enslaved people were just simply essentially like unpaid interns. And it's like, no, they were
Right,
very much not.
right. Which is very hurtful. I read something. It was a tweet that Dr. Vanetta West put out, and she says slavery was not an internship, and it was not a work study program. Slavery was rape, it was torture, it was dismantling families, it was trauma, it was cruelty, feasting on the calf of capitalism.
Mhm.
Slavery was vicious, and to retell that story or have a revisionist approach to communicating those ideas does not only does it harm the humanity and the dignity of Black folks, but it really, is an attack on my ancestral heritage, um, and it does a grave injustice for Black educators, even in the state of Florida, who are find themselves they're Black people, right? And they're
Mhm.
also caught in the tension of wanting to educate and truth tell. So it's horrible. It's hard.
Mhm.
Yeah.
Mhm. Absolutely. Well, so that's a little bit about what you learned kind of in the research of the book. Was there anything that came up while you're writing the book where you're like, "Wow, I didn't know that about myself?" So was there any sort of personal learning or personal growth that happened in the writing process that you didn't know about yourself before?
Yeah. Yeah, to be honest, Mason, I signed this deal to write this book. I wanted to really explore my own journey of learning, Black history as it was taught to my by my grandparents, and
Mhm.
explore some of the racism that I experienced in predominantly white churches. Um, and I did not know that I would find myself in a car accident having to learn how to walk again. And
Mm.
so, when I was writing this book, I was dealing with physical and emotional trauma because, I was in a car accident and they were saying that I wouldn't be able to walk for a year and a half. So I had to work through that while being committed to, completing the draft of the book. And, many days I was writing, I was just I could not move. I had no
Mm.
mobility. And I was just reflecting on all of the traumatic things that I had experienced as a Black person in white spaces, really trying to do the work of solidarity, but in term, in you call it naivety or just like believing that some of these institutions that I was a part of had my best interests at heart,
Mhm.
and really bumping up against the reality of no, this is still very much upheld by white supremacy and whiteness and all of the
Mhm.
things that cause harm to Black people, mainly myself because I was a pastor in these contexts. And so I really just leaned into that and allowed those experiences to influence my writing in a way that was not just not filled with hate, but like just a real examination of what I've gone through as a Black person and how I wanted to tell my story and truth tell. Yeah.
Mhm. Absolutely, absolutely. Well, let's dive into the book now. obviously this book is largely about Black history, but it's not just learning Black history for the sake of learning Black history, but also how history and understanding history can transform our present moment. And so, can you talk a little bit about the importance of why it's so important to understand history so that it can transform our present reality? So, yeah, thoughts around that.
Yeah. You know, there there's so many different things that kind of um orients or creates what I would call like a social framing of how we see the world, right? You
Mm,
have you have religious upbringing where maybe you were influenced by, your religious environment, the way that people talked about God, or the way that people associated God in relationship to other people, right? You have your cultural perspective, like what you were gleaning from your cultural environments, what and how those environments, kind of influence you to see the world. Sometimes these things are taught verbally, but then sometimes those things are like caught in terms of like what you watch other people do. And then there are like things where there's like this historical lens, right? We just talked about it a moment ago about like how are you actually viewing history? Like, are
mhm,
you viewing it through a lens of patriarchy? Are you viewing it through a lens of what Dr. LaGarrett King would say, the lion, right? As long
mm,
as the hunter, right, holds the pen, the story will always uplift the hunter and not those who have been hunted or considered prey, right? Then you have personal experiences, right, where maybe you have some type of affinity bias or a complicit bias where you like only surround yourself with people who believe a certain rhetoric or a certain way. All of these things, right, kind of create the constructs in our minds in the ways in which we talk about history, engage history and God, and all of those things, and how we see ourselves in relationship to other people who may be around us. And all of those things have the power to influence whether you actually show up with
mm,
love, with proximity, with solidarity, And one of the things that I'm really trying to get at in this book is being the awareness piece, and not just the awareness to um, challenge someone else's story, right? Because we can never prop ourselves up as an expert in somebody else's actual
mm,
lived experiences. But that awareness, opening ourselves up in a way where we allow the awareness and the proximity of being immersed in someone else's worldview literally take root in us and influence the ways in which we might have a skewed view of the world. And so I'm really doing that type of work in relationship to history and theology, because I think history has been used as a weapon, right? And not something that has been liberatory in the ways in which we, resist repeating what has happened, right?
mhm,
When I talk about what was happening in the 1900s and the early 20th century about the removal of Black history, we see some of those same things repeating themselves, you
totally.
know, right now. And so, are we allowing the awareness to just be something that we are aware of, but we're still in resistance to that, or are we allowing that to actually change us from the center of who we are and orient
Mm,
us in a place where we don't make those same harmful mistakes, because we have examined history and we've seen how it has been violent to other people. And then God, right? What is the relationship of God in all of this?
mm,
And how we view God, our theological perspective, is God only serving to an elitist few, or and with the exclusion of others in mind? So I'm wrestling with all of those things, my friend.
mhm.
Yeah.
Absolutely. Yeah, one of the reasons why I love this book so much is the fact that you don't just like again teach history or make the proposal of history being taught like actual true black history being taught for the sake of history, but that it actually that awareness, that education can actually is one step towards solidarity. It's one step towards actually transforming the world. And so it's a necessary step, but it is a step. It's not an end in and of itself.
Right. No, it's not. It is an important step. Um, I my research was grounded in political and social rhetoric. I was looked at public policy as it relates to those who are poor, and that poverty has caused them to be unhoused in America. And so this is just one example. Like I was giving a lecture the other day, and somebody asked me, "Well, how is homelessness related to race?" Right? Because
Mm,
this is a class issue, and then here we have, where's the racial dynamic? And I was talking about the intersectionality of various identities that people carry. So, like when I did research in the state of Tennessee, I was looking at a public policy that has become a policy problem that causes sleeping outside to be a felony for those who are unhoused. But when I was doing my actual research, race kept coming up. I
mm,
was interviewing people less than a mile away from where ML King's life was taken. He was assassinated. And I was interviewing, white women and white men. And the thing that kept coming up was, I wish my black friends had some access that I have that they don't. Now, you know, both persons were unhoused, the black people and those who were white. And I said, why? And this one lady named Catherine, she says, I can go in restaurants and use the restroom and I'm not questioned because of my whiteness.
mm,
But I've seen some of my black friends who are unhoused go in and they are turned away. Um, and so, like when you talk about all of these different things, and I'm just talking, their race is a huge part. The different identities, the intersectionality of race and class, and all of those things. They're important to know. Why? Because the information, right, or the findings aren't just findings for us to turn away. They're
mm,
findings for us to really consider, what does God have to say about this? How should I show up in the world in a way that is best suited to display what I believe is a theological perspective that I hold to my heart. And if
mhm,
people aren't really wrestling with that question, I think we're doing ourselves a disservice.
mhm. One of the words that I saw very, very frequently throughout the book, and you've already mentioned it a few times in this conversation, is solidarity. You talk about
Yeah,
solidarity a lot throughout the book. Uh, can you talk a little bit about how you understand solidarity?
yeah. When I was thinking about the best display of solidarity, there's a name that came to mind: Joshua Heschel,
Mm,
which is, he was a rabbi, a Jewish theologian, but Joshua Heschel actually stood in solidarity with ML King
mm,
in the 60s. When King was about to march in 1965 for voter rights, right? From Selma to Montgomery. Who joined in? A Jewish rabbi. Like,
mm,
and then he goes on to say about his approach to social awareness and being ecumenical and all of these beautiful things. And King does the same thing, in standing for Jewish rights. And I'm like, wow, you know, how much solidarity of heart do you have to go and lament with others, right?
mm,
To be broken where other people are broken, to weep with other people who are weeping about issues that you don't even have to even encounter, really, right? And so when I think about solidarity, I'm thinking about the ways in which we have allowed our hearts to posture themselves in a way where we genuinely lament with others. And I talk about this in like the solidarity framework, but like lamentation is powerful because, you know, lamentation is, is dealing with agony and
Mm,
suffering and the realities that exist in our present moment in ways in which that truly has the power to build connection. You know, um, I don't think you can fully stand in solidarity with people that you haven't heard their laments and that you haven't joined in that lament in some way where you're like, wow, like this is this is vicious, and I care about my neighbor so much that I am willing to make the investment of lamentation, of both listening and hearing, but also in being in constant proximity. And then
mm,
also think about, you know, um, the immersion, that King and Rabbi Hashel displayed with each other, immersing themselves in the world and the worldview, and allowing the realities of you know what they were faced with to really speak. I think solidarity is immersion. Solidarity is putting yourself not just in geographical location, but being truly proximate in a way where you are allowing the life of someone else to speak to you,
mm,
you know? And, what I've seen is like this distant kind of immersion, right? Where it's like, I want to stand with someone, but we haven't really made ourselves proximate. So it's like really distant. And, I oftentimes say, as it relates to, the subject or the advocacy that I do in terms of those who are poor, like distance is the enemy of belonging.
mm,
It's the enemy of belonging, right? You can't truly say that you're standing in solidarity with someone that you have refused to be proximate to,
mhm,
and allow their world to speak to you in a way that breaks your heart, changes your perspective, causes you to deal with some embedded biases that you may have, etc. Right? Because most times when people give a rationale or theological explanation as to why they haven't been proximate, right?
mhm,
I I would argue and push back that the God that you are referring to is too small, right?
mhm,
Um, so immersiveness, and I think that the lamentation and the listening and the learning and the immersive nature sets you up to have compassion and empathy. It
mhm,
sets you up to stand alongside others, in resistance to things that may be oppressing them. And that's when you use your voice,
mm,
you know, um, because you're using your voice not to necessarily edit the story of someone else's suffering,
mhm,
but to pass the microphone. Yeah.
mhm. Mhm,
Yeah.
absolutely. I love to get a little sciencey in this podcast, but one of the things I love learning about is mirror neurons, and I think one of the really cool and powerful things about mirror neurons is it really is what gives us the capacity to have empathy with one another. And so, if obviously, I can't. There's no way I would ever be able to like fully experience what you experience in the world, obviously, but
Sure.
with our mirror neurons and our ability then to have empathy, like if you and I were in really deep relationship with one another, what you experience in the world, I can at the very least be moved by what your experiences are. And I think that like being moved by those things hopefully would move me towards solidarity of relationship with you, and your experiences in the world. And so I think that's what is really cool and powerful about being a human is we have such a high concentration of mirror neurons, which allows us then to have empathy and then be moved into solidarity with another.
Yes, that is so beautifully stated. I was just hanging out with a dear friend of mine, Dr. Uh, Liva, and he's like a neuro chiropractor. And
Okay.
I yawned right the other day, right,
Mhm.
just randomly, and he yawned, and I said, "Bro, like, is it true that yawning is contagious?" And he said, "No, it's mirror neurons. The ability to see yourself, your brain connects with someone else's lived reality, and it doesn't necessarily know how to distinguish at some point that this is not your lived reality." But we were talking about that in relationship to empathy and compassion, which is brilliant that you brought that up. Like, to be able to see your humanity wrapped up in the humanity of another person gives you that vehicle to create that compassion and that empathy that, you know, if you are wanting to stand in solidarity with someone else, you
Mhm.
know.
Mhm.
Yeah.
Absolutely. One of the things that you bring up a little bit in the book is about diversity. And I've had this conversation a few times with other folks on this podcast, but it's like a sort of a conversation that I've been having with myself at least quite a bit. And that is the role that diversity should play in our world. And I think a lot of times it seems as if especially a lot of like white institutions, like white liberal institutions, really see diversity as an end unto itself. And I think that that actually is maybe not the right role that diversity should play in our world. Like a lot of white liberal institutions think, you know what, if we just get like X amount of black people and X amount of women and X amount of, queer people or whatever it is, right? But if they just like have like, 25% black people and 25% Asian people and whatever, right? And I actually don't, yeah, that's great and wonderful, I think, to have that kind of diversity. But if that doesn't fundamentally change these institutions, then what good is that diversity for? And this is part of the reason why I have some skepticism about like churches that really bill themselves as like multicultural or multi-ethnic churches, is because a lot of times those churches are still very much operating within white supremacy. And so even though they might be like visibly very diverse, they actually aren't living into, I think, like a liberative reality. So anyway, I'm curious, like the way that you think of diversity. I think the way I think of it is diversity is a result of a institution that is actually being liberative, and so I see it more as a result rather than a means to a result.
Right.
Anyway, I'm curious,
Yeah.
like your
Yeah.
thoughts on all of
No.
that.
No. I would, man, brother. I mean, I've been in institutions where diversity was held up or regarded as the thing that is solving an issue, and it's not. It's the
Mm,
very basic surface level thing that you can do. You know, um, diversity without equity, without justice, without love, without belonging, without access is just decoration.
I love that.
That's what
I
we.
mean, I've said this before, and maybe some people get really upset by it, but I would rather have a church that's 100% white but 100% committed to anti-racist work than a church that is 100%
Mm,
diverse but absolutely not committed to racial justice work.
wow, that's profound. I mean, I get the message that you're saying. You're saying that if there's a justice issue that is causing harm, you would rather have a church that is solely committed to addressing and resisting that issue versus having a church that is diverse and doing absolutely nothing,
Mm. It's
you know?
exactly what I would say.
Yeah. Brother, like again, diversity is it is decoration. It is it is the it's icing.
Mm,
It's cotton candy. Really. Um, I remember working with a church, and you know, they asked me to be a part, and I agreed because I am a person that truly believes in standing solidarity with anyone who is willing to do that work, right?
hmm
No matter what their social location or background is. And so I found myself as the only black person on staff, and was asked to, speak up and to give critique and all of those things. And what I really found was that they wanted diversity in my skin for marketing, but not
Mhm.
my voice for truth telling, for repair, for the necessary things that really oriented me in a way, or postured me in a way where, I gained leadership and I did all of those things. And so I think diversity itself is very basic. And it's something that is not necessarily doing the work. Does diversity offer representation? Yes, but are you using that representation to actually address the social ills that cause harm? And if the
Mhm.
answer is no, then I would tell anybody to reevaluate.
Mhm, mhm. Yeah, I work for a seminary, and right now we're going through, like, this anti-racist initiative all throughout every department of the seminary, and,
Wow.
there is a lot of conversation about diversity and, like, are we diverse enough, all that kinda stuff, and, where can we improve in diversity, and I've kind of, like, pushed back and said, I don't know if that really should be our fundamental question." My question, or I think the thing that we should be most committed to is, how can we actually, as an institution, be committed to racial justice work? And then if diversity happens out of that, great, wonderful. But let's actually just be committed to racial justice work, and maybe the diversity will come and follow along. But I don't think the commitment should be to diversity. It should be to specifically racial justice.
Yeah, yeah. Racial justice is should be at the foundation, right? And what grows from that is equity. What grows from that is access. What grows from that is belonging. What grows from that maybe be even tearing some things down, right? And rewriting
Hmm.
some things, right? And so, yeah, I would say I agree, brother,
Hmm.
100%.
So you obviously have done a lot of poverty awareness work throughout your life, and um, there was a book. I'm trying to find it right now, and I'm blanking on the name of it. Actually, it might be on my phone here. Um, but there's a book that I've been really curious about that really explores the relationship between race and class. And I think a lot of times, some of the really famous work that we see right now about racial justice work really essentializes race, or it reduces race. And I think there is far more interconnection between race and class than I think a lot of people realize. The book is called, by the way, it's by a person named Torrey F. Reed. I think I'm saying their first name right, but they have a book called Toward Freedom: The Case Against Race Reductionism. But it really does explore that connection between race and class, and how I think essentially the argument of that book, I haven't read the full book, but essentially the argument is that with that the invention of race completely connected to class difference, and classism. And so, anyway, I'm curious, like, because of your poverty awareness work, like, how you see that intersection between race and class, and all of that. So, anyway, thoughts around that.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, to date in contemporary the modern mass homelessness era, black people make up 13% of the population and account for 50% of those who are unhoused in the
Mm,
US. 50%, bro. And when you look at homelessness history, right? Specifically, we can even look at the first mass era of homelessness that many people would argue is happened around the Great Depression in the 1930s. Well, in the 1930s, Jim Crow is alive, right? And redlining happens, and the first group that protests homelessness, in the U.S. Capitol were World War I veterans, right?
mm,
Which were young white males, considered the bonus army, right? And that put a lot of pressure on the government, which later in the 1940s, 1944, you have the development of the GI Bill. You know who didn't benefit from that bill? Black people who are also fighting in the wars, right? And
mhm,
so even looking at something as simple as redlining, right, which concentrates poverty. It excludes a group of people, right? Black people, and it causes the ripple effect of not being able to access land and housing and all these things, which creates more accessibility into the plight of those who are unhoused in the U.S. Why would you? We can move to how convict leasing, right?
Mhm.
Created the opportunity for the mass incarceration complex, and how majority of the people who are like in this system right now are black and brown people. Bro, like race and class, you can't separate the two.
Mhm.
And I think to do a real examination of history and how race was socially constructed and used in many instances in relationship to power, to define groups of people, to limit groups of people, to write
Mhm.
policies against groups of people. All those things creates the class, as Isabel Wilkerson say, the caste system that causes some people to be at the bottom while others are propping themselves up with elitism. Yeah,
Mhm. Mhm.
yeah.
A lot of times I've seen in more evangelical spaces that have, again, like, try to make this commitment to, like, diversity or whatever, or racial justice even. They might even go that far. They still seem I think a lot of those initiatives in those spaces seem to be very meaningless because in my estimation is that they're completely divorced from politics. Like, they don't want to actually address, like, the political issues around racial justice. They just want to think, well, if we just make our church more black, or if we just, like, be in relationship or something, that will fix all these problems. But I actually think that in order for us to do really meaningful racial justice work, we actually have to have some sort of political framework that we're operating out of. And so I'm really curious what your thoughts are around, like, the way that politics plays a role in racial justice work, and maybe there are certain political frameworks that you utilize when you do racial justice work.
Yeah, man, that's a loaded question, Mason. I think at the basic level, people just don't understand how policy is used, how you know people get their interests right on the public agenda or in any agenda. I don't think they understand the three laws of power and how political figures can exert power in what would be defined as a non-decision. A non-decision is, keeping someone's interests off of the public agenda to be discussed, to be addressed in ways in which that protects a group or populace of people around issues that may be causing them harm. I don't think people really understand the power dynamics of policy, and I don't think they understand policy in relationship to people who they say Jesus has caused them to love. Right?
Hmm.
I'm supposed to love my neighbor as myself, right? In most instances, people are talking about the neighbor that is just like them, right?
Hmm.
That looks like them, that talks like them, that votes like them, that blah blah blah, like them, right?
Hmm.
And in reality, Jesus is challenging people to love those who are not like them. And if you're truly going to love your neighbor, then you have to love the neighborhood that that neighbor emerges from, and you have to be concerned with the issues that that neighborhood faces. And I don't think they have allowed themselves to understand the relationship of how policy impacts that neighbor that they say God has
Hmm.
called them to love, right?
Hmm.
I think at the very basic level, we need to start with. I think we should, be educating people about how policy is keeping them from really loving their neighbor as themselves. I do. I don't. What about
Hmm.
you?
Yeah, I mean, like, for example, I've thought, great, like, you can have a friendship with, like, a black person, but what does
Right.
that mean for policies that are made that imprison black people disproportionately, right? So,
Right.
like, again, just having that relationship, again, I don't think is necessarily end onto itself, I think also you need to have like good politics that affect the policies that happen in our world. And so yeah. Anyway, that's the reason
Yeah.
why I think racial justice work is not just simply like making friends with Black people. There's actual policy decisions that need to be made, and if you're working with policy decisions, then that means you actually have political frameworks that you have to operate in, which is part of the reason why I, in the last number of years, have been so interested in abolition work, because
Mm.
I see it as like a very robust political framework that not only transforms the way that I relate to people interpersonally, but also obviously informs the way that I think about policy decisions made at local governments, state governments, federal governments, all of that.
Yeah. That's, I think that is a really great distinction. I think the other thing too, which becomes problematic, is that most evangelicals think that the racial reconciliation conversation is racial justice.
Mm. And
And
you briefly talk a little bit about this in the book too, about that whole racial reconciliation conversation that happens a lot in those circles.
yeah, because that, I mean, that is what you're getting at, right? Like where it's like, oh, let me let's just be friends, let's dialogue, let's have forgiveness, you know, um, those sort of things. But yet you can't forgive yourself out of policies that have been written that targets communities, right?
Mhm. Mhm.
You can allow that to be a stepping stone to orient your heart in a way to ask the questions like, what more needs to be done that is harming the person and the group of people that I'm seeking to be in relationship with, right?
Mhm.
Racial reconciliation is not racial justice. Racial justice looks at systems and structures and things that actually uphold oppression against the people that you want to be in relationship with, if that makes
Mm.
sense.
That's a
Yeah.
word right there. So again, you do explore Christianity and, the Christianity's role in racial justice work, and you've already kind of briefly mentioned a little bit of that. Dr. Willie Jennings, a number of years ago, wrote this incredible book about the origins of race and how Christianity played a significant role in the invention of race. But I also believe that as much as Christianity has done a lot of harm in the invention of race, and then obviously its history of racism. But I also believe Christianity has a lot to offer racial justice work in this world. And so, as much as it contributed to a lot of the racism that we experience in the world, it also, I think, has a lot to offer racial justice work in the world. So, what does the Christian tradition have to offer the racial justice movement?
Yeah. Man, so many authors that came to mind, but one in particular, theologian Howard Thurman, writes this book, Jesus and the Disinherited.
Mm,
And he talks about how Jesus was born poor, he was born under oppression, and he was a minority. And he uses the historical life of Jesus, in relationship to build this bridge to understand what does it mean to live in a society when your back is against the wall, when
mm,
you are born oppressed, when you are born as someone who is amongst a group of a few. He said he uses the language minority. You are born poor, right? And these systems and structures have been designed to keep you and hold you there, right? But he also looks at the liberatory work of Jesus, and how he has, message a liberation for those who have been born with their backs against the wall, who becomes an example of what it means to navigate that type of suffering, but
hmm
then points ultimately to God about the work and hope of God in the world. And I think, um, the gospel is social.
hmm
The gospel includes people, right? People are being oppressed by various things that may be unjust. Dr. William Barber says it this way, in relationship to poverty, right? He says, you know, over 700 people die per day, not because God has called them home, but because they're living in poverty.
hmm
And what type of good news do we have against the systems and structures that make it harder for people to access healthcare? What good news do we have in hopes to build, or reframe how we are thinking about automatic guns and weapons. What is God? I'm talking about a public theology, right?
Mhm, mhm,
Because most times when we think of theology, we're only thinking about it, or most people are only thinking about it in ways that are very pious and individualistic.
mhm.
I think that we have a good framework in the Christian tradition to think more broadly about what God has to say about the injustices that are plaguing our world. Yeah,
Mhm, mhm. Yeah, I remember when I first encountered liberation theology in college and certainly read a lot of it while I was in seminary, and then to be able to explore some of these biblical stories that are very overtly political, but, growing up in white evangelicalism, I would have never read them that way, and to have to be able to read them in a way where they are so political, it just really transformed the way that I look at the gospels and even
yeah,
other biblical stories.
yeah, yeah. Because you're reading the scriptures from the bottom up, not the
Mhm.
top down. Um, I made a statement yesterday. I was invited to screen film in a church, and I said something to the effect that Jesus experienced public sanitation in the same way that the unhoused community
Mhm.
experiences public sanitation, and he was displaced. And they say, where is that? It's like, remember Herod, who sends out a decree to murder the firstborn, and an angel came to literally give them a message to be displaced, literally had to uproot from where, that displacement, speaks to those who have been displaced. Herod was holding, uh, in many, I would argue, a political stance. He gave a decree, right? He had the power to make policy verbally for this to
Mhm.
happen. And Jesus experiences displacement. You don't think that Jesus Jesus's life speaks to those who have been publicly sanitized because of laws and ordinances without having anywhere to go? You don't think the life of Jesus understands what it means to be ostracized and born? Can anything good come out of Nazareth? I would say yes. Something good can come out of. I'm in Atlanta, Bankhead. Something can come good out of the parts of town that people have demonized
Mhm.
because they believe a rhetoric about a people, and not see the true value and the humanity and the dignity that people possess that God also loves in those communities. So,
Mhm. Absolutely,
yeah,
absolutely. You also talk about difference in your book, and I love the way that you talk about this. So can you talk a little bit about why difference is a feature in God's creation rather than like a flaw of God's creation?
yeah. God is not. I don't view God as monolithic.
Mm.
Um, I don't view God as homogenous. I don't view God as singular, right? Um, I think God is mosaic, is diverse, expresses diversity in creation. In that, when you look out, you don't necessarily see the same thing, right?
Mhm.
And I think that difference is beautiful. And anyone who postures themselves to think otherwise about that difference doesn't hasn't really um, encountered God.
Mhm. I mean, I would even go as far, even outside of like material things like
Yeah,
humans or animals or plants
yeah,
or whatever. I also think like difference in like theology. Now, certainly, I think there is some theology out there that is abhorrent, and that's the theology that is rooted in trying to make things the same. But I think a theology
yeah.
that is rooted in trying to embrace the difference. I think there's so many beautiful theologies out there, and I think they all magnify one another in their difference.
Yes, yes. that was beautifully stated. Yeah, I just God is speaking in the diversity of all of that, and any type of theology that denounces that type of difference is, as you said, it is abhorrent.
Hmm. Hmm.
Yeah.
One of the things that I typically like to ask folks is the very practical things that listeners can do right now. So, what are some practical steps in engaging racial justice work that a listener right now could pause this podcast and they can go out and do right now? So, are there any practical steps that you can think of that would help somebody who's like, "Oh, this conversation is really like, just really giving me a lot of passion and hope right now. I want to do this thing right now." What are some things that folks can do right now?
Yeah, I was doing another podcast with it was like a group, and they said that they were committed to like racial justice, etc. And towards the end of the podcast, similar question, and then I flipped the question back on them. I'm not
Mm,
doing that to you. I'm just using this story. And I said, "Well, what does the rhythm of your life look like?" And they listed a bunch of stuff that had no relationship, no proximity to anything that oriented them to be even remotely close to anything racial
mm,
justice oriented. Um, and I asked them why, and they really discussed the fear. I say you
mm,
want to support black businesses, but you predominantly eat and drink coffee in white coffee shops, right?
mm,
You want to invest in black communities, but you haven't been proximate enough to even understand how people need to be supported or to be stood with, right? I think one of the greatest things that a person can do is look at the rhythm of how they're living their life, and then think of ways in which you can reorient your life that puts you in close proximity to the very
mm.
thing that you say you want to be a part of, you want to stand for, and not just do it online, right?
Right.
We're not. I'm not arguing that tweeting something or sharing something on Instagram or Threads now, or whatever social media platform isn't good because people need awareness. I'm talking about how are you physically, geographically positioning yourself, or even carving out just 1 hour a week to be in proximity to the thing that you say you care about.
Mhm.
I think that would revolutionize anyone's approach to understanding how they can best serve, right? Because if you're just like coming up with a bunch of solutions and you haven't been proximate to people, you could cause more harm than you can help.
Mm. Mhm. Yeah, that like, we've talked a little bit about how a relationship with somebody is not in an end unto itself, but it's an important part of it, and it goes hand in hand
Huge.
with also having the right sort of policy, ideas that you might have, but all of that is so important, and they go together, and so that's
Yes.
one of the reasons why I love your book, and the way that you do your work is that the proximity, the relationship matters, and also all these other things that you need as well matter as well. And so I think that's what's so cool about your work is that you really stress all of these things being really important to racial justice work.
Yeah, they're both and,
Hmm.
it's both and. Um, I'll share this before you close. I remember I was talking about relief work, and when I say relief work, I'm talking about meeting physical needs of those who don't have access to resources. And this person sought to challenge me. He says, how are you going to provide all this relief? And you need that people need development. I said, well, it's both and, right? And then he came with that whole teach a man how to fish quote, right? And I thought about it and I said, you can teach somebody how to fish, but if you haven't fed them while they're learning, they'll pass out before they learn anything. It's both and. Um, it's being proximate, it's standing with people, it's centering their voices, It's finding ways where you can lament with them. It's spending time. It's being in resistance to the very things that people have said is causing harm to them. It's not
Mhm.
about what you think, it's about what they think, and being close enough to their voice to trust their voice and their lived experiences that postures your heart to stand in solidarity with them.
Absolutely. Last couple questions here, Terrence. How do you hope All God's Children inspires and liberates its readers?
Man, um, yeah, honestly, Mason, when I was writing this book, I was just really trying to be my honest self, talk about the ways in which racism has affected me, the ways in which I've learned my own history, and the ways in which that has informed my work. And I hope that when people encounter the pages, they, pause for a moment to really think about the ways in which they've been taught history, the talks
Mhm.
that they were given, whether verbally or non-verbally, the ways in which they have either approached race in class conversations or have not approached it at all.
Mhm.
I hope my hope that the way that I've written this book whole space for the both and right they encounter
Mhm.
and they can really encounter and say, well, it can be both. I can really grapple with historical things that were really violent and traumatic, but I can also take that to inform what I do in my present moment, how I stand in solidarity with other people, and how I really show up with the ways in which I view God theologically, and display that practically and orthopraxy in the way I show up in relationship to those
Mhm.
that I'm around in the world. So I hope it does that.
I love that. Last question, Terrence. How can listeners get connected to you and your work?
Yeah, if you want to follow me online, I'm Terence Lester. That's Mtrencellester. That's on all social networks. And if you want to look up the work that we do with Love Beyond Walls, you can visit lovebeyondwalls.org, or look up Love Beyond Walls. That's at Love Beyond Walls on all social media platforms. Yeah.
Love it. Love it. Well, thank you so much for chatting more about the book. I think it's absolutely incredible. And so thank you so much for writing about it and chatting more about it.
Thank you so much, Mason.